Coming up.
Joseba Ecija led a discussion on closing this net zero finance gap with Carbon Tax Carney, Mark Carney, UN Special Envoy for Climate Action and Finance. So this is the first implication. I mentioned the tie-in, Mr. Chair.
It just brings home the point. Have in 9 years, have these people learned nothing? Or maybe they have learned something, but they've learned the wrong lessons. They've learned that they want to further refine this model of bringing together big business and big government to the advantage of a few well-connected elites.
Minister Tassi had personally signed off on an ESDC McKinsey contract worth $5.7 million. Can you please explain why the minister stated that the government was not involved when there was clear evidence of another minister signing a contract?
So do you consider the public interest? Do you consider the impact on those families from giving such a large volume of contracts to a company that was instrumental to their suffering? Is that part of your calculation, or is it not something that you do, or you're supposed to, or you're able to take into consideration?
This Guy's Garage. Like and subscribe.
Mr. Chair, we are here, of course, to discuss federal government consulting contracts awarded to McKinsey and Company. And this is an issue, as you know, we've been looking at for some time. I do believe, however, one of our significant conclusions in doing this large study on McKinsey was the inexplicable fact of the implication of Mr. Dominic Barton. So this is something that the official opposition focused on significantly, was the implication of Mr. Barton in his efforts with this government to run the government. However, Mr. Chair, we now have a new player, lo and behold, the new and latest advisor to the Prime Minister, Mr. Chair, Mr. Mark Carney. Carbon Tax Carney, if you will, conflict of interest Carney, if you will, Mr. Chair. And for those of you who are listening who do not know Mr. Carney, I'd like to read an excerpt from Maclean's. Carney strides down the hall, beaming and vigorous, a man who looks born to inhabit the slimmest, silkiest Savile Row suit that Sterling can buy. With a much publicized pay packet of $1.7 million, he can well afford it. Young aides scurry around him, clutching files, checking encrypted phones, trying and failing to keep up with their 54-year-old boss. Much has been written about Carney's good looks, but in person, it's not so much the symmetry of his face that's remarkable as the way he moves, which is fast with the loose-limbed precision of a dancer, Mr. Chair. Perhaps he'd like to try some Bollywood with the Prime Minister sometime. But his ties to McKinsey, Mr. Chair, are also clear and evident. I have here the schedule from COP28. McKinsey at COP28, insights from our events. How can we deploy climate finance at a scale? McKinsey's Cindy Levy and Joseba Ecija led a discussion on closing this net zero finance gap with Carbon Tax Carney, Mark Carney, UN Special Envoy for Climate Action and Finance. So this is the first implication. I mentioned the tie-in, Mr. Chair, of his good friend Dominic Barton. We have here in the same Maclean's article a quote which says, he makes no effort to hide what his friend Dominic Barton, former McKinsey chief and now Canadian ambassador to China. And I'll also add, Mr. Chair, that lo and behold, it was Mark Carney who took the place after Dominic Barton of the advisory chair of the economic growth group that the Prime Minister put together. He described Mark Carney as the giant computer sitting on top of his head. So indeed, these two are very good friends. As well, this Maclean's article points to a part-time gig performed by Mr. Carney, where he was paid the sum of $1 US per year. Sounds very similar to the amount that Dominic Barton was in fact paid to lead this economic growth group. But I think the most relevant piece here today, Mr. Chair, is Mark Carney, in his role as the head of the Bank of England, the chair of the Bank of England, called in, who else? McKinsey, but to overhaul the process at the Bank of England. I have this news report here. Mark Carney has called in U.S. management consultants McKinsey to oversee a shakeup of the Bank of England strategy to impose a radical makeover on the old lady of Threadneedle Street. again, I point to the relationship between Mark Carney and Dominique Barton. Again, someone who's been inextricably tied to McKinsey and McKinsey's implication in the running of this government. When its managing director, Carney's fellow Canadian Dominique Barton, was asked in a recent interview with Management Today if he knew conflict of interest Carney, he replied, yes, he's a great guy, a tri-sector athlete, public sector, private sector, and government. He's fully rounded. It gets into debate, a great signal that the UK gets talented people in from abroad. Talented people, Mr. Chair? Or people connected to McKinsey? That's my question here today. So, Mr. Mills, my first question is, in 2013, when Mark Carney was the governor of the Bank of England, one of his first decisions was to use McKinsey to completely overhaul the bank's organization, as I indicated. Based on your experience with McKinsey, in your opinion, is it a good idea to allow an outside organization such as McKinsey and not public servants to completely overhaul government systems?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question. I would not be well placed to answer whether that was advisable in that circumstance, but I would say that if you were to do a major transformation of any organization, you'd want to have a plurality of views and perspectives to get the best result.
Thank you very much. Madame Boudreau, I'll continue with you. A former member of the bank's Monetary Policy Committee at the time said it's not clear what the government is getting from the highly priced Carney, who is supposed to do this stuff himself. Do you think Canada is headed in a similar direction? We've seen a lot of unrest from the public service lately, displeasure with this government, displeasure with your minister, Anita Anand, who is, of course, responsible for the Treasury Board and the public service. Do you think Canada is headed in a similar direction, that we are using highly paid consultants and friends of the Prime Minister rather than the people who should be able to do the work themselves?
Thank you for the question. And like we share with the committee at few occasions, it's always a question to see if we have in-house the capacity to do the work. And when it's not the case, we have some needs to go outside and have the proper skills that we need in order to advance the priorities.
Thank you, Dominique Barton. And now, conflict of interest, carbon tax Carney, Mr. Chair, tied to McKinsey. Thank you very much.
Was there any evidence that you have seen, that you're aware of, that there was any political interference?
Thank you for the question. Based on the work that was performed last year by the internal audits departments, which there are independent internal audit function of each department, and also work in conformance with the Institute of Internal Audits, the conclusion was that there was no interference.
Based on any of the investigations that were done, either by the Auditor General, by the Procurement Ombudsman, by PSPC, and by Treasury Board, was there any evidence of corruption that you came across?
I will refer again to the OPO report as well as the AG report and our own internal audit. There was no political interference.
And and was there any corruption evidence that was found in those 4 investigations?
Same conclusion, no.
The idea that the procurement strategy appeared to be designed in 4 of the 28 competitive contracts, the procurement strategy appeared to be designed and implemented to suit McKinsey and Company. And, it reminded me of some of the findings related to ArriveCan, where in some cases the vendor was in communication with the procuring agency around the criteria for the procurement, so that, it's essentially about designing a procurement strategy to fit the needs of certain vendors so that they get the work. And I think we can all agree that when it comes to competitive procurement, that's kind of against the rules. Like, that's not how it's supposed to work. I see you nodding. So, this feels like a bit of a no-brainer, and yet this is what the Auditor General says looks like happened here. And she goes on to say, it found that McKinsey was not a pre-qualified vendor under the supply arrangement originally considered. The contract requirements were then modified to be able to use a different supply arrangement. No documentation was found that would support the change in approach. Now, my question, there are 2 things that could be happening here. One is that they made the right decision, they just didn't show their work. And the other one is that they made the wrong decision and they actually put their thumb on the scale for McKinsey. And my question to you is, which of those two scenarios is the true one? Which reflects the reality of what happened in those 4 cases? Or sorry, 2 cases, 2 of the 4.
For the question. So I think it's important to keep in mind that we were dealing with various departments, so many departments were part of that finding of the OAG. I can assure that oftentimes this is something common. A procurement officer will ask questions, will shift, basically will provide advice to the client. If, for example, McKinsey was not qualified under particular solution, I think it's normal looking at the requirement that the client is trying to achieve to basically make sure that we've got the right instrument. So I wouldn't want to draw references for that. I think it has to be put in that context. And on top of that, also, this is something that we are asking our procurement officer to do much more, is to challenge and to document. So if a decision is made, we don't want to be in a situation where negative inference is being drawn. So we want to be able to document why that advice was provided, what was the rationale of it. And I think really putting the emphasis on challenge function, challenging the client to make sure that the reason why they're doing a certain procurement strategy is the right one and fulfill the obligation of transparency and fairness.
I appreciate that, Mr. Laporte. It doesn't seem to get to the question, which is the Auditor General found that the procurement strategy appeared to be designed and implemented to suit McKinsey. Perhaps a more pointed question would be, if that was indeed the case, would it have been inappropriate?
Well, if indeed that would have been inappropriate if it was, I think some of the finding also, what we were putting in place.
That was yes,
it would have been inappropriate. So I think also looking back at other practices, so we did put in place non-competitive standing offer with McKinsey. So we were going with McKinsey, advertising basically for these contracts, we're going with McKinsey based on the proprietary right information that was there. So I think it's important to situate that. In terms of the other contracts that were competitive, I just want to point to the fact that they were done by various departments. So the motivation as to why a certain procurement strategy was chosen, I'm not able to comment on that one.
Mr. Generous, go ahead. Thank you, Chair. Thank you to the witnesses. I want to build on some of the comments of my colleague, Ms. Kuzi. My biggest concern is that we have this McKinsey model of inappropriate relationships between government and big business that is actually being deployed again with the appointment of Mark Carbon Tax Carney. In general, I would say that a free market economy requires a sharp distinction between government and business, especially big business. Public entities have to be able to make neutral and fair decisions based on the common good and without personal favoritism. They respond to democratic deliberations about the common good. And then private entities, on the other hand, are partial. They seek to advance their own interests. They are primarily responsible for advancing particular goods as opposed to the common good, and they play an important role in our economy as players on the field advancing their own particular interests. And one of the biggest problems we've seen in politics over the last 9 years has been a blurring of these lines. Big government and big business getting together, in particular big business getting into government and seeking to shape outcomes to their advantage. And the call for good people to engage in public service is used as an excuse for allowing some very elite personalities to keep a foot in both worlds. It's fine for someone to come from the business world into politics, provided that they're prepared to sever ties and not be bridging these two worlds in a way that creates serious conflict of interest problems. And yet we've seen this, what I would call a McKinsey model. Dominic Barton was chairing the Finance Minister's Advisory Council on Economic Growth. Andrew Pickersgill at McKinsey was supporting Dominic Barton's efforts by supplying analysts to the government. At the same time, Mr. Pickersgill was involved in selling to the government. There was a generous so-called offer from McKinsey to serve, while at the same time using the access that they gained to sell, and they made a lot of money in the process. That is, I see, the core problem that undermines independent, impartial public deliberations about the common good and skews the playing field to the advantage of a well-connected private company. So today we're seeing the deployment of the McKinsey model again in the case of Mark Carney being appointed a economic advisor to the Liberal Party, which is, of course, in government for the time being. And he is at the same time maintaining various leadership positions in the private sector, particularly with Brookfield. And it's come out that Mark Carney, the sitting chair of Brookfield, at the same time as he's advising the governing party, at the same time as Brookfield is applying to Ottawa for the creation of this massive multi-billion-dollar asset fund that would be extremely advantageous to Brookfield, the company that he is in charge of. So, I look at what's happening here from the Dominic Barton corporatist fusing together of government and big business, and then I see the same thing happening again with Mark Carney, and it just brings home the point: have in 9 years have these people learned nothing? Or maybe they have learned something, but they've learned the wrong lessons. They've learned that they want to further refine this model of bringing together big business and big government to the advantage of a few well-connected elites. So I want to put it to the officials. Do you see a problem with this model, this structure that allowed McKinsey and that is now allowing Brookfield to have a level of access that simply would not be available to any other normal private company?
Mr. Chair, I really couldn't speak to the relationship and the role of these entities in advising the Prime Minister of the government, that we're not involved in that at all. I can say, with respect to McKinsey, the volume of contracts went up when we put in place a non-competitive benchmarking instrument. Lots of departments were looking for benchmarking. Right now, we've taken measures that is...
Okay, I am going to press you to just comment on this advice piece, because you see the problem that Dominic Barton comes in, Andrew Pickersgill, running the Canadian operations, is supplying analysts to the government at the same time as he's selling to the government. That access is access that others didn't have, and so in getting from there to the master standing offer, I mean it's pretty clear that there's some relationship between the access and the result.
Just a brief answer, please.
A brief answer. I failed to see a connection between advice to the Prime Minister and the government on economic policy and a Director General from a department such as ESTC that's implementing an IT project seeking a benchmarking study.
So on the financial management piece there, we've seen consulting firms and service contracts rise year over year, if we even go way back to 2010. But can you talk a little bit about the decline? We're seeing a decline now, and to what extent the federal government is depending on these firms.
As previously discussed here by myself, actually, the government went ahead last year with refocusing government spending. The refocusing government spending had two components. One of them was to reduce operating budget and also grants and contribution. And the other component was to reduce professional services. And the President of Treasury Board tabled during Supplementary Estimate B last year a reduction in professional services of about $350 million. And when she did table the main estimate, there was also an amount there in reduction of professional services as well.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I'm just reviewing again through OPQ's order paper questions some of the contracts that were awarded. $1.8 million with a contract extension to McKinsey to advance cultural evolution through stakeholder analysis. That's quite the contract for $1.8 million. $339,000, a sole source contract. $500,000, $517,387, another sole source contract, and then a $5.7 million contract from August of 2022 to February of 2023. So significant contracts. On February 6, 2023, your minister at the time, Helena Jazik, said that of the 24 contracts that were awarded to McKinsey by PSPC since 2011, 3 of them, worth more than 50% of the total value, were awarded through open, fair, and transparent competition. Yet, according to the AG report, you were only responsible for 3 contracts totaling over $26 million, and only one of these were competitive. Why was that the case, please?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So we had 3 contracts. The 2 other were non-competitive. One got cancelled, so there was basically no call-up issued. And the other one was below $25,000, which will allow for a non-competitive contract in those instances. So PSPC, 3 contracts, one of around $26 million, that was a competitive one, and the one that got cancelled was the one that was below the $25,000 threshold.
Thank you very much for that response. Also, further to our questioning last year, I would like to please get on the record how many cases of contracting fraud and contracting abuse has your department and the government turned over to the RCMP, please? How many?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Unfortunately, I'm not the responsible for that. This is our oversight branch, Madame Catherine Poulin, that did appear many times, that has these numbers and that has oversight for cases of fraud and those cases that have been referred to the RCMP.
Okay. Well, RCMP said in the spring they have approximately 7 investigations related to federal contracting. So I was looking for the total number, but it's evident to me that more is to come. On February 6, 2023, the PSPC minister, again at that time, Minister Jazik, stated that the minister's office is not involved in any way in awarding these contracts. According to the Procurement Ombudsman report that came out earlier this year, the previous PSPC minister, Minister Tassi, had personally signed off on an ESDC McKinsey contract worth $5.7 million. Can you please explain why the minister stated that the government was not involved when there was clear evidence of another minister signing a contract?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. So that one was exceeding the delegated authority of our deputy minister at the time. It's routine practice to send those instances to the minister. So, and this is something also that got confirmed by the procurement ombuds when they did appear in front of this committee, in terms of the reason why that one got directed to the Minister Tassi back then. Thank you.
Well, I would think if the minister is required to sign off on contracts while simultaneously knowing little about the contracting, wouldn't it mean that the minister would be incapable of making independent choices, as my colleagues and I have been inferring about contracting?
Just to clarify, Mr. Chair, the approval for the contract in question was by Minister Tassi. I believe that the comment that you made around none coming to her office was Minister Jazik.
Okay. Well, Mr. Chair, I wonder what the purpose of the Minister of Procurement is if it's not, in fact, to procure the contracts and sign for the procurement of the contracts. Mr. Chair, my final question will be, my colleague, Mr. Genuis, have shown that there is an absolute link between Dominique Barton and Mr. Carney to McKinsey, and therefore McKinsey's oversight of this government. And given the evidence that we have put forward throughout the last spring and continue to put forward today, the horrible record of McKinsey in many regards, which we have provided an example of before, their implication in the opioid crisis, their holding of a major event next to a Uyghur camp. My final question is McKinsey and Company banned from applying for contracts with the Government of Canada? Please say yes.
Mr. Chair, McKinsey and Company is eligible to compete in processes for contracts with the Government of Canada.
Expect more from conflict of interest, carbon tax, Carney, Mr. Chair.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Mrs. Atwin, please. Or Ms. Atwin, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being with us again today. The report speaks about, the audit report speaks about a contract where there was a lack of security documentation on file for a project. In particular, one individual whose security clearance wasn't found. Can you explain what happened in this case, and did someone without security clearance work on this project?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question. I can confirm that, as I said in my opening statement, that all resources that worked on these contracts were cleared for had appropriate security clearances. I cannot speak to why the documentation was not added to the file. It was not a question of whether the individual did not have security clearance. It was an issue that there wasn't a document on file confirming that they did. We have taken measures, and we're put in place now a checklist to ensure before any resources start work on contracts that they have confirmed, and we have on file confirmation that they have sufficient security clearance to undertake the work.
And when it comes to the national master standing offer mechanisms, PSBC has already said that these mechanisms are all being allowed to expire and to not be renewed. So McKinsey's expired more than a year ago, for example. So how many active national master standing offers remain, and what measures have been taken surrounding professional services service contracts awarded under the NSMO mechanism?
So in terms of the one that were in issue with the OAG finding, so all of them are basically no longer active. They've been cancelled, they were not renewed. So I want to say that in terms of benchmarking, an MSO with McKinsey or other firms with respect to benchmarking services, those are no longer in place. And what we've seen also, the ability to put a non-competitive NMSO or standing offer in place is now being basically delegated at the ADM level. So I don't think we should be seeing those very often, and I fail honestly to see the need for those tools now. I think they've been put in place. We had the opportunity to renew our prices, to have a second look at that. So we're kind of taking into account the feedback that has been received. So those tools in future will be extremely rare, and this is why delegated authority is at the ADM level to put them in place.
Great. So I know that PSBC is working on a replacement mechanism. Are you able to share any updates on that process?
Yes, of course. So when we look at this particular categories of services, they are complex because there is one component that is oftentimes proprietary. The data that belongs to a particular company that they've been able to acquire through various survey of the industries as a whole. You want to know where you situate yourself amongst your peer. So these basically large players do have proprietary information. What we want to do is basically carefully kind of dissociate what is a subscription services from what we're going to be doing with those subscriptions. So if the goal is to receive advice to a department, to a DG, that should be a compulsive process. That advice component, that professional services component should be basically run compulsively. So there's no reason to extract and then take that and then ask for a sole source. So this is what we want to address and we've been addressing. So competition is the norm for those services in future.
I want to start with a comment about the relationship between McKinsey and the opioid crisis. As I think is relatively well known by now, Purdue Pharma was largely responsible for the opioid crisis by over-promoting with false information new opioid products that they produced. It was presented as sort of the catch-all, problem-free solution to pain, and it led to intense personal pain and trauma for so many families, and that is continuing. At a time when people were becoming aware of many of these problems, Purdue Pharma sought the assistance of McKinsey to try to whitewash what was going on. And McKinsey worked with Purdue Pharma and gave them advice that would horrify the moral sensibilities of most Canadians about various tools that they could use to try to keep the money pouring in at the expense of people who were negatively affected by opioid substance use disorders. Our proposal as Conservatives is to make the pushers of these drugs pay financially for all of the costs associated with the opioid crisis, and to put that money into prevention, treatment, and recovery, to make the pushers pay for the problems that they caused, and to use those resources to assist people who are struggling. The approach of the current government, by contrast, is actually to continue to pay the pushers, to continue to allow McKinsey to benefit from lucrative government contracts, and to have a so-called safe supply policy, which continues to see money go to Purdue Pharma to produce opioid products that are then given away at taxpayers' expense to people who are struggling. They are paying the pushers while we want to make the pushers pay. What would you say to Canadians who find it deeply troubling and offensive that companies like McKinsey, like Purdue Pharma, are still cashing in big time as a result of government contracts instead of being held accountable for the damage that they caused?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question. I would say that, again, in being responsible for procurement, I wouldn't really be able to speak to the policy and the outcomes with respect to the opioid crisis. What I can assure Canadians are, with our new Office of Supplier Integrity and Compliance, we are analyzing companies. We're looking for instances where companies have maybe defrauded governments, where they have been involved in corruption and collusion, and we're making sure that we're not doing business with those entities. With respect to the NMSO and the work that was done, I would note that that work has been done by McKinsey & Company Canada and has been very focused on benchmarking, transformation, IT, procurement, not on health advice.
Okay. Look, this is a question about procurement, right? It's not a question about health policy. It's a question about procurement. When procurement decisions are being made, and you have tens of thousands of Canadians that have died as a result of the opioid crisis, those procurement decisions, the companies that benefit from those procurement decisions, obviously a message is sent to Canadians, to their families, to their communities who have suffered, when companies that, in this case, McKinsey, that was part of the process of offering advice to Purdue Pharma, is able to benefit from these contracts. So do you consider the public interest? Do you consider the impact on those families from giving such a large volume of contracts to a company that was instrumental to their suffering? Is that part of your calculation, or is it not something that you do, or you're supposed to, or you're able to take into consideration?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question. When we're looking at procurement, again, some of the factors we take into, is a company legally able to operate within the country? We'll look at, have they been convicted, or are they charged with fraud, corruption, collusion in Canada, in any provinces or territories, and other...
Yeah, so I'm just going to jump in because I'm running out of time. The irony of this, though, is that this government has for so long been reluctant to hold these big corporations accountable for what happened in the opioid crisis. So your criteria for considering them eligible for procurement, whether or not they've been held accountable for these actions, isn't triggered precisely because this government has failed to take actions to hold these companies accountable. You have a close relationship between Dominic Barton and McKinsey and the government, a failure to hold them accountable, and then that lack of accountability being invoked as a justification for continuing to use them to procure services. Meanwhile, so many Canadians have suffered as a result of the opioid crisis. McKinsey and Purdue have had to pay massive compensation in the United States. McKinsey alone, I think, $500 million in the United States. They're not being held accountable because of the cozy relationship we see between these big corporations and the government.
Thanks. It is past our time.
Unfortunately, there seems to be ever increasing practice of infantile name-calling and an attempt to disparage prominent Canadians who promote success around the world. I guess my question to you, is it appropriate then for leaders to seek out global economic advice from industry experts?
Thank you for the question. As I said before, I think if you're dealing with large transformations, in which many of these projects involved, it is appropriate to try and look globally to G7 counterpart countries to see what other countries are doing, to see what lessons have been learned in similar type projects as part of the formation of strategies, and to also benchmark and compare how you're doing.